This thing is a Diplophagan, specifically a Diplophagus sapiens. This is a humanoid alien species I created on my imaginary planet Domum Alpha, but just like Homo sapiens aren't the only species of human that ever walked the Earth, there were once many species of Diplophagan as well. While only Diplophagus sapiens survive today, understanding their extinct relatives can help us understand Diplophagus sapiens themselves. Diplophagans are part of a clade called Piasmacheirids, which are heavily based on Earth's primates. 12 million years ago, in the rainforests of this island called the Great Isle, some Piasmacheirids started developing ape-like traits. They grew larger, lived longer, had larger brains, and spent more time on the ground than in the trees. I call these creatures Magnapithecans. Magnapithecans got onto the Great Isle via these islands through various land bridges and natural rafting events. It's over here in the western oceanic continent that xenotetrapods originated as a whole. Piasmacheirid and especially Diplophagan evolution heavily depended on the exact geography and history of this region. As the environment changed around them, it sometimes allowed them to spread far and wide, and sometimes restricted groups to specific regions. Roughly 6 million years ago, some Magnapithecans started walking on two legs much more, and using tools in more sophisticated ways. I call these Gallagheirids, and they're the earliest Piasmacheirids that I would call humanoid. They're sort of comparable to Australopithecus or Homo habilis. Gallagheirids lived in the savannas of the northern Great Isle, while most other Magnapithecans lived in the southern rainforests. Taking to the savannas certainly assisted Gallagheirids because at this point Domum Alpha had spent over 5 million years in an ice age. This dried out the climate, forcing rainforest clades to compete fiercely for resources while the savannas were thriving. 5.75 million years ago, Gallagheirids diverged into two clades, Diplophagus and Paradiplophagus. The difference between them is a certain reproductive adaptation that is a story for another time.
Okay.
For now, suffice it to say that it's a vital enough adaptation that Diplophagans outcompeted their cousins quite quickly.
That's death.
Basal Diplophagans had long, strong arms and hair covering most of their bodies. By the way, these drawings I'll be showing throughout the video purposefully omit their head and body hair just so the anatomy is clearly visible. Early Diplophagans had large teeth, protruding jaws, and a small cranium. They lived in groups of 30 or less, mostly in the eastern savanna near the coast, where the climate was mild and humid and there was plenty of food. They were also crepuscular, meaning they were active around sunrise and sunset, and slept through the middle of the day and the night. This was an ancestral trait inherited from earlier Magnapithecans. 4 million years ago, some Diplophagans began living further inland. They lived in smaller, more tightly knit social groups, allowing greater mobility and cooperation to share resources. They also developed migratory behaviour. By moving around large territories rather than staying in one area, it was easier to find food in their sparsely populated environment, and they could better avoid droughts and extreme heat. While their relatives on the coast became diurnal, these Diplophagans remained crepuscular, which helped them endure the midday heat. These inland Diplophagans were also fully bipedal, so I call them Diplophagus orthios. Those living on the coast were Diplophagus aplos. Over 11 million years ago, Domum Alpha came into an ice age, which it's still in today. Within an ice age, the climate varies between extremely cold glacial periods and slightly warmer interglacial periods. At the present day, both Earth and Domum Alpha are in interglacial periods. But 3.7 million years ago, not long after Diplophagus orthios evolved, Domum Alpha dove into a glacial period. Sea levels dropped, climates dried out, and temperatures fell. This was good for all Diplophagans at the time. Falling sea levels turned the Great Isle and surrounding Great Island chain from this to this. Though the south and east were still blocked off by rainforest, the adaptable Diplophagus orthios quickly spread north to new territory, as far as the Tokaj Peninsula on the northern continent. This shift also increased Diplophagus aplos's range, allowing them to spread further inland now that they had no neighbours to compete with. They didn't exactly thrive further inland, but I guess they were there.
Well, she tried. At least, she...
As Diplophagus orthios spread up the island chain, they had to adapt to a variety of new environments, not just tropical deserts and hot steppes, but also dry and humid temperate regions in Tokaj. Some populations even became fully diurnal. Some Diplophagans even spread north of Tokaj to the frigid boreal forests of the region I call Andej. While those in the south were adapting their behaviour to their new environments, these Diplophagans relied more on their physiology. 3.64 million years ago, Diplophagus orthios split into two clades. Those living in Andej developed more body fat and more hair. Their hair also got finer and more coily, and on a microscopic level it had more pronounced scales. These traits provided excellent insulation. They also became diurnal, and their skin got a bit lighter, which helped them absorb vitamin D from sunlight in their new, darker habitat. These Diplophagans are appropriately named Diplophagus borealis. Meanwhile, those living further south were developing larger brains and new behaviours. They were constructing shelters, some were fishing, and 3.53 million years ago, they started using animal hide as clothing and water skins. Like Diplophagus orthios, some populations became diurnal, but not all. For their growing intelligence, I call this species Diplophagus habilis.
I have the mind of a mastermind.
Having only existed for 200,000 years, Diplophagus borealis split again into two clades. Some spread further north where there was less competition for resources, and they specialised even more to their Arctic habitat. They grew much larger and developed bulky bodies and shorter limbs, which helped maintain a high body temperature. Their heads shrunk down with a small cranium and large protruding jaws like their Magnificent ancestors. These Diplophagans also used tools much less than Diplophagus habilis, preferring twigs, branches, and stones over more specialised options. I call them Diplophagus giganteus. Slightly to the south, other descendants of Diplophagus borealis thrived in the boreal forests, actually spending a lot of time in the trees. Unlike their gigantic cousins, this species' limbs grew longer and their bodies smaller, with a smaller stature overall. This helped them reach between branches and move around in the trees. They developed strong, claw-like nails and hands and feet suited to climbing. Also, unlike Giganteus, their brains got slightly larger than their ancestors, not smaller. I call this species Diplophagus pumilus. Over the next 1.5 million years or so, Domum Alpha gradually warmed up. Diplophagus pumilus spread further north into the territory of their giant cousins. 2.2 million years ago, the warming climate and increased competition drove Diplophagus giganteus extinct.
That's death.
They were the first Diplophagans to go extinct, having lived for 1.22 million years.
Death.
Climates shifted as the glacial period ended, and more importantly, the many land bridges across the Great Island chain were cut off. Rising sea levels split Diplophagus habilis into many isolated populations, and 1.8 million years ago, these split into different species. Those in Tokaj continued to adapt to their temperate environment. They became diurnal, their brains grew larger still, and their jaws shortened, giving them flatter faces than other species. 1.5 million years ago, they started using fire, and 750,000 years ago, they started cooking their food. This species is called Diplophagus tokajensis. Those on the Great Island chain were likely not a single species, but many isolated species with unique traits. But, for my own sanity, we're treating them as one, and they did share lots of traits anyway. Many populations relied on the oceans as a food source, maybe even swimming long distances between islands. To support this semi-aquatic lifestyle, they developed more body fat and less hair, which kept them warm and streamlined in the water. They grew taller with longer limbs and large hands and feet, making them exceptional swimmers. Their lungs and hearts expanded and their eyes adapted to see underwater as well. This species is called Diplophagus serenigensis. For the sake of this scientific name, I'm referring to the Great Island Chain as Serenesia, which roughly translates as series, sequence, or row of islands.
Oh, she passed away? Oh. All right.
400,000 years ago, Domum Alpha returned to glaciation. This reformed the land bridges across the Great Island Chain after being cut off for 1.7 million years. Recall that Diplophagus pumilis adapted a smaller torso and longer limbs to aid their semi-arboreal lifestyle. Importantly, these are the opposite adaptations to those that allowed Diplophagus giganteus to thrive in their cold Arctic habitat.
Death.
Those that spread further north after Giganteus's extinction were the first to suffer, and only 10,000 years into this new glaciation, Diplophagus pumilis were driven extinct, unable to cope with the changing climate.
That's death.
300,000 years ago, a Diplophagan clade split in two for the final time, at least so far. While previous divergences have involved significant adaptations even for semi-arboreal or semi-aquatic life, this final split was more subtle. In northern and central Tokaj, harsher climates forced Diplophagans to cooperate and organise, living in slightly larger groups and developing sex-based division of labour. They efficiently gathered resources using a wide variety of tools, travelling to hunt and forage, and consuming a varied diet. They were even capable of creativity and abstract cognition. So it might not surprise you to learn that this species is called Diplophagus sapiens.
She's an icon, she's a legend, and she is the moment. Now come on now.
In the warmer regions of southern Tokaj, Diplophagians weren't forced to adapt so much. They lived in smaller groups than Diplophagus sapiens with no division of labour, and they mainly ate what was abundant in their immediate area, with more meat in their diet too. They were short and stocky, and while their heads and brains were actually larger than Diplophagus sapiens, they were weaker at numeracy, creativity, spatial awareness, and abstract thought. And their tools were sophisticated, but they were less varied than those of Diplophagus sapiens. This species is called Diplophagus eurostos. They quickly began spreading back down the Great Island Chain over the reformed land bridges, coming into competition with Diplophagus serenigensis. While serenigensis were large, strong, and generally well adapted to island life, Eurostos had use of fire. They cooked their food and they wore clothing more often, which aided them in harsher territories. Serenigensis populations also started falling due to interbreeding between the two species. Another important factor in the fall of Diplophagus serenigensis was disease. They had been living in small, isolated groups along the island chain for 1.5 million years before the arrival of Diplophagus eurostos. This isolation gave them little protection against illnesses from the continent, so the spread of Diplophagus eurostos was devastating. The combination of interbreeding, epidemic, and plain old out-competition drove Diplophagus serenigensis extinct 296,000 years ago, just 4,000 years after the arrival of Diplophagus eurostos. When Eurostos arrived on the Great Isle, Diplophagus aplos met much the same fate as serenigensis.
Death to all of them.
In their case though, out-competition was much more significant. Diplophagus aplos had had the Great Isle and a few other islands to themselves for nearly 3.5 million years at this point, and they saw very little adaptation in that time. They didn't use fire or wear clothing, they weren't even fully bipedal. Diplophagus eurostos also had far superior tools. So, 294,000 years ago, Diplophagus aplos went extinct as well. Having driven two species extinct in very similar ways, it's ironic that in time Diplophagus eurostos would meet the same fate.
It's what she deserves.
75,000 years ago, the latest glacial period on Domum Alpha ended, and the planet came to look how it does today. 60,000 years ago, Diplophagus sapiens developed their first fully fledged language.
Oh my god, who said that?
But that's a story for another time. 50,000 years ago, they spread beyond the peninsula of Tokaj across the northern continent. 20,000 years ago, they began spreading down the Great Island chain by boat, competing and interbreeding with Diplophagus eurystos as they went, and probably spreading disease as well. They arrived on the Great Isle 2,000 years later, and 1,300 years after that, Diplophagus eurystos was extinct, leaving just one Diplophagan species left in the world. Diplophagus sapiens went on spreading, being the first Diplophagans on the oceanic and southern continents, and later the other continents as well. But, like I said, that's a story for another day. This has been the first of 4 videos I'll make on Diplophagans as a species. While we've talked a bit about their anatomy already, it's been fairly superficial, looking at their adaptations to different environments rather than the details of their bodily systems. That's what we're doing next time, examining in detail most of the anatomy of Diplophagus sapiens. Anon, friends.